All right, take three. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, in the heart of America, a silent purge was underway well before Trump was elected in 2024. Not a purge of criminals, not necessarily a purge of enemies of the state, those who criticize the regime too loudly, or even a purge of wicked immigrants. We're talking about a purge of voters. Granted, MAGA will lie and claim those they purged were all illegal immigrants or maybe gang members or Antifa communists or whatever, but they are most often lying. We're instead talking about ordinary citizens, students, workers, retirees, people who believe in the promise of democracy, but they discovered their right to vote had been quietly erased. So today we're talking about the Purged, the Vanished Voters of Trump's America, a 2020 short documentary directed by David Ambrose and narrated by Debra Messing. It's just 14 minutes long, but it packs a punch because it shows how millions of Americans, especially people of color and young voters, were wiped from voter rolls in some key battleground states. And it asks a question that's just as urgent now as it was then. Who gets to vote in America and who doesn't? So let's look at what the film shows here. And I've got a few thoughts on it, I'm sure that I'll share. So the documentary follows investigative journalist Greg Palast, who I actually covered before on this podcast. I did a little bio, so feel free to check that episode out. Anyway, Greg digs into how names disappear from the voter rolls in states like Michigan, where I live, Wisconsin, and Georgia. States where just a few thousand votes can decide the outcome of a presidential election. And the numbers are staggering. At least 17 million voters were purged nationwide between 2016 and 2018, according to a study by the Brennan Center for Justice. In Georgia alone, hundreds of thousands were removed. The reasons? Well, often flimsy. Some were accused of moving, even if they'd only changed apartments or moved two houses down the street. Others were penalized simply for not voting in a previous election, even though the law clearly says you can't be removed for that reason. Then there's the poison postcard, a piece of mail that looks like junk mail. If you don't send it back, you risk being purged from the voter rolls. So it's really bureaucracy weaponized. And this documentary looks at the human stories behind these statistics. I think it's valuable for that. It's good to look at the people, to focus on them and not just the statistics, because it makes the issue more real. It's similar to, I always use this example. One of my one of my relatives had died in a mining accident. I don't know if it was a great uncle or a great grandparent, but anyway, the the example became more real when I looked at the pay stubs of this person. I saw that, oh, this person actually did exist. So if you've got faces and names and further evidence of what you're talking about, well, it just becomes a more compelling documentary or whatever, just a more compelling fact. So, one Milwaukee County supervisor, Sequana Taylor, was told that she'd been purged because officials thought she'd moved, even though she was still very much at home. Another Milwaukee County supervisor, Peter Burgellis, was temporarily purged from the voting rolls after a third party vendor incorrectly flagged him as having moved, even though he had not. So he rectified the situation, but what if he had acted too late? And a college student found himself off the rolls after moving just down the block. And in one of the most gut punching moments, the film shows how even relatives of Martin Luther King Jr. weren't spared. So it's not abstract, it's not just statistics, it can actually be personal. And, It matters even if it's not happening to you. Some people say voter fraud is the big threat, but here's the reality: voter fraud is vanishingly rare. What is happening over and over are systemic barriers that keep people from casting ballots, and it doesn't hit everyone equally. Communities of color, young people, lower income voters, they're the ones most often purged. As activist groups like Black Voters Matter point out, it isn't random, it's targeted, strategic, and it's a way of shaping who gets to decide the future of the country. So it really has an impact. And this film might be short, but it had a bit of a reach, with Debra Messing narrating and celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio sharing clips. It broke out of the usual activist circles and may have made at least a tiny little dent in the narratives. And, that visibility mattered at least a little bit because it wasn't just about outrage, it was about action. The filmmakers urged viewers to check their registration through sites like SaveMyVote2020.org. It was a reminder that democracy isn't self executing. You have to fight for it every election, every time. So, looking ahead, here are here we are past 2024, staring down another high stakes election in 2026. The same battles over voter purges, mail in ballots, and quote unquote election integrity are still raging. Some states are tightening rules further, while activists scramble to keep people from being erased, and the stakes could hardly be higher. As John Lewis once said, democracy is not a state, it is an act. Every purge, every false accusation of fraud, every poison postcard is an attempt to stop that act. But every time someone checks their registration, every time they show up at the polls, despite some hurdles, they're sort of pushing back. So the purged, the vanished voters of Trump's America isn't just a documentary about 2020, it's sort of a warning shot for today, because the question remains: will the vanished voters of America be silenced again in the future, or will their voices finally be heard? So, thanks for listening. If you want to watch the film yourself, you can actually find it on YouTube, and go ahead and check it out. And also check your registration, that's more important. Make sure your vote still counts. Otherwise, you know, uh, democracy only works when we all have a voice. And that's, of course, both in terms of elections and otherwise, because, democracy also is an idea even greater than electoral, thingamabobs. Democracy, equality, everybody having a say in how things happen. That's something that's greater than elections, and people don't often enough emphasize that. Sure, elections can be a part of the process, obviously, but the general idea of equality is actually greater than any election, and it's how you also thwart bad election outcomes, because you know if you have actual democracy in your culture, in your society, well, you're already going to have safeguards against those bad election outcomes. So keep that in mind, and feel free to check this documentary out. It's actually pretty decent. It's not that lengthy, so if you have spare time, it might be worth it.